If a 10-year-old boy from a small mountain town in Colorado were to walk into a courtroom tomorrow, and if the judge were handed a file containing every single thing that boy had ever done, what would happen next? That is not a hypothetical anyone expects to answer with a straight face. But South Park has been running for more than 25 seasons now, and in that time, Eric Theodore Cartman has compiled what might be the most extensive criminal record in the history of fictional television. Not the most violent, not the most disturbing necessarily, though he would certainly compete for that title as well. The most extensive. The sheer range of offenses is what sets him apart. There are characters in fiction who kill. There are characters who steal. There are characters who manipulate and deceive. Cartman does all of these things, and he does them with a frequency and a creativity that borders on the surreal. He has committed hate crimes. He has committed fraud. He has committed kidnapping, false imprisonment, assault, biological warfare, and acts that could reasonably be classified as terrorism. He has manipulated the United States Congress. He has formed a cult. He has orchestrated what amounts to cannibalism by proxy. And through all of it, he remains, at least on paper, a child, a fourth grader. Then a fifth grader, a boy who still lives with his mother and still rides the bus to school every morning. The question is not whether Cartman is guilty. The question is what the American legal system would actually do with someone like him if it ever had the chance. This is Paper Town. Settle in and get comfortable. This one is going to be a long one. The place to begin, as with any legal proceeding, is with the question of jurisdiction. Where does Eric Cartman live, and what laws govern his behavior? The answer is South Park, Colorado, a fictional town that the show places in the Rocky Mountains. Colorado is a real state with a real legal code, and because the show has never permanently relocated its characters to another jurisdiction, every crime Cartman commits falls, at least initially, under Colorado state law. This matters because criminal law in the United States is not uniform. What constitutes a felony in one state might be a misdemeanor in another. Sentencing guidelines vary widely. The age at which a juvenile can be tried as an adult varies. And in Colorado specifically, the rules governing juvenile prosecution have undergone significant changes over the years. Under current Colorado law, a person under the age of 18 is considered a juvenile. The minimum age for prosecution in juvenile court was historically 10 years old, though recent legislative efforts, particularly House Bill 1249, have sought to exclude children younger than 13 from being prosecuted in juvenile court entirely, except in cases of suspected homicide. For direct filing in adult court, Colorado law generally requires that the juvenile be at least 16 years old at the time of the alleged offense, and that the charges involve a Class 1 or Class 2 felony or a crime of violence. A minor as young as 12 can potentially be tried as an adult for Class 1 or Class 2 felony charges under certain transfer provisions. Eric Cartman is 10 years old. He started the series at 8, moved to 9, and currently sits at 10, placed in the 4th and later 5th grade. Under the strictest reading of Colorado law, many of his offenses would place him below the threshold for juvenile court prosecution entirely, at least under the newer legislative framework. But here is where things get complicated. Because Cartman has not committed one crime. He has not committed 10 crimes. He has committed dozens, possibly hundreds, depending on how one counts individual acts within a single scheme. And among those crimes are multiple homicides. Under Colorado law, even the youngest offenders can be prosecuted for homicide. And that changes everything. There is also the question of federal jurisdiction. Many of Cartman's crimes cross state lines, involve federal institutions, or implicate federal statutes. His fraud upon Congress is a federal offense. His piracy on the high seas is a federal offense. His hate crimes may fall under federal jurisdiction pursuant to the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. His acts of terrorism, to the extent they qualify, fall under the purview of federal law enforcement. A real prosecution of Eric Cartman would almost certainly involve both state and federal charges, running concurrently in different courts, with different prosecutors, different judges, and different sentencing frameworks. The logistical complexity alone would be staggering. But before we get to the courtroom, we need to understand the defendant. And to understand Eric Cartman, even superficially, is to understand why the legal system would struggle so profoundly with his case. He is not a career criminal in any traditional sense. He does not commit crimes for the reasons most criminals commit crimes. He is not desperate. He is not addicted. He is not mentally ill in any way that the law recognizes as exculpatory. He commits crimes because he wants things, and other people are either obstacles to getting those things or tools to be used in getting them. His crimes are motivated by desire, by ego, by prejudice, and by a fundamental inability or unwillingness to recognize the humanity of the people around him. He treats other people the way most people treat furniture. They exist. They serve purposes. And when they stop serving purposes, they cease to matter. This is not a psychological profile that the criminal justice system was designed to handle in a child. The system has frameworks for mentally ill children. It has frameworks for abused children. It has frameworks for children who act impulsively, who are influenced by peers, who lack the cognitive development to fully understand the consequences of their actions. But it does not have a framework for a child who is cognitively advanced, emotionally stunted, morally indifferent, and strategically brilliant. That child falls through every category the system has created, and lands in the space between them, where the law has no ready answers. There is also the question of Cartman's intelligence, which is frequently underestimated by the people around him and should not be underestimated by a court. His academic performance is mediocre at best. He shows little interest in school and frequently disrupts the classroom. But academic performance and intelligence are not the same thing. Cartman demonstrates extraordinary ability in areas that are not measured by standardized tests. He is a skilled manipulator who can read the emotional states of others and exploit them with precision. He is an effective leader who can recruit, organize, and direct groups of people toward a common goal. He is a strategic thinker who can develop multi-step plans, anticipate obstacles, adjust to changing circumstances, and execute complex schemes over extended time periods. He understands institutional structures, legal frameworks, social dynamics, and human psychology at a level that would be impressive in an adult, and is frankly alarming in a child. A comprehensive IQ assessment would likely reveal that Cartman's intelligence is significantly above average, concentrated in areas related to social cognition, strategic reasoning, and linguistic persuasion. These are precisely the cognitive abilities that make him so dangerous, and precisely the cognitive abilities that the academic system fails to identify, nurture, or redirect. Now, with that understanding of the defendant in place, the most logical place to start building the case is the crime that defines Eric Cartman more than any other. The crime that transformed him, in the eyes of the audience and the show itself, from a spoiled, bigoted bully into something far more dangerous, something more calculated, something closer to evil. The Events of Scott Tenorman Must Die, Season 5, Episode 4, originally airing on July 11th, 2001. The setup is almost quaint by Cartman standards. A ninth grader named Scott Tenorman sells Cartman his pubic hair for $16.12, convincing the younger boy that purchasing pubic hair will somehow accelerate his journey into puberty. When Cartman realizes he has been duped, he becomes fixated on revenge. His initial schemes are petty and they fail. He tries to get Scott's pants pulled down at a football practice. He tries to train a pony to bite off Scott's penis. These plans are childish and unsuccessful, which is exactly what Scott expects. What Scott does not expect is the final plan. Cartman arranges for Scott Tenorman's parents, Jack and Mrs. Tenorman, to be killed. He manipulates a local rancher into believing the Tenormans are trespassing, which results in the rancher shooting them both. Cartman then collects their bodies. He butchers them, and he cooks their remains into chili, which he serves to Scott Tenorman at a public event called the Chili Con Carnival. Scott eats the chili, he eats his own parents. And when Cartman reveals what he has done, he licks the tears from Scott Tenorman's face. The episode ends with Cartman savoring Scott's anguish, while Radiohead, Scott's favorite band, whom Cartman had also invited to the event as part of the trap, looks on and calls Scott uncool for crying. The show itself acknowledged this as a turning point. Series creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone stated that this episode represented a significant shift in both the writing of the show and the characterization of Eric Cartman. With this episode, Cartman became, in their words, the most evil kid in the world, and the character only got darker from there. So what would a prosecutor do with this? The answer depends on how one classifies the killing. Cartman did not pull the trigger himself. He manipulated events so that a farmer would shoot the Tenormans, believing them to be trespassing on his property. This creates a layered legal problem, but not an insurmountable one. The most obvious charge would be first-degree murder, which in Colorado requires deliberation and premeditation. There is no question that Cartman deliberated. There is no question that he premeditated. The entire scheme took days, possibly weeks to execute. He planned every step. He anticipated Scott's reactions. He anticipated his friends' reactions. He set up the Chili Con Carnival as the venue for maximum emotional impact. He invited Radiohead. The level of planning is extraordinary. The fact that he did not personally fire the weapon does not shield him from a murder charge. Under both Colorado law and general principles of American criminal law, a person who solicits, aids, abets, or conspires to commit a murder can be charged with murder itself. Cartman orchestrated the killing. He set the chain of events in motion with the specific intent that the Tenormans would die. That is textbook solicitation of murder, and in many jurisdictions, it carries the same penalty as the act itself. There is also the concept of felony murder, which imposes murder liability on anyone who causes a death during the commission of another felony. Cartman was engaged in multiple felonies when the Tenormans died, including fraud, conspiracy, and potentially trespassing. Under the felony murder rule, the deaths that result from those felonies can be charged as murders, regardless of whether the defendant intended anyone to die, though in this case the intent is beyond doubt. In Colorado, first-degree murder is a Class 1 felony. For an adult, the penalty is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Colorado abolished the death penalty in 2020. So that option is no longer available. But life without parole is the maximum sentence, and given the premeditation, the cruelty of the aftermath, the utter lack of remorse, and the sadistic pleasure Cartman takes in Scott's suffering, it is the sentence a prosecutor would pursue with absolute certainty. But Cartman is 10 years old, and that is where the legal system begins to fracture under the weight of its own assumptions about what children are capable of. The desecration of the Tenormans' bodies adds additional charges. Under Colorado law, abuse of a corpse is a Class 2 misdemeanor, which might seem almost absurdly light given what Cartman did. He did not merely desecrate the bodies, he cooked them. He served them as food. He tricked a grieving son into consuming his own parents' remains. A creative prosecutor might also pursue charges under food tampering statutes, assault charges related to the forced ingestion of human remains, and potentially additional charges related to the emotional and psychological harm inflicted on Scott Tenorman. A civil suit for intentional infliction of emotional distress would be inevitable, though collecting damages from a 10-year-old with no assets would present its own challenges. The episode 201, the 6th episode of the 14th season, later reveals that Jack Tenorman, Scott's father, was also Cartman's biological father. This means Cartman unknowingly orchestrated the murder of his own father and fed him to his half-brother. In a legal proceeding, this detail would be largely irrelevant to the criminal charges, as Cartman did not know about the biological relationship at the time of the killing. But it would be devastating in terms of psychological evaluation. A child who kills his own parent, even unknowingly, and then shows no disturbance when the truth is revealed, presents a profile that would alarm any forensic psychologist tasked with assessing competency or recommending sentencing. And that is just one episode, one crime, one entry in a file that stretches across more than 300 episodes and more than 25 years of television. But already from this single episode alone, a prosecutor could build a case that would dominate a courtroom for weeks. 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of a corpse, 2 counts, assault through food tampering, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and depending on how creative the prosecutor wanted to be, potentially additional charges related to fraud, since Cartman deceived Scott about the nature of the food he was consuming, and reckless endangerment, since the ChiliCon Carnival was a public event where other attendees were also potentially exposed to contaminated food. The Scott Tenorman case, standing alone, would be the most notorious criminal case involving a juvenile defendant in American history, and it is not even close to being the worst thing Eric Cartman has done. There is a concept in criminal law called modus operandi, which refers to the particular method or pattern a criminal uses to commit their offenses. Cartman's modus operandi in the Scott Tenorman case reveals several characteristics that recur throughout his criminal career. First, he uses manipulation rather than direct action, getting others to do the dangerous work while he orchestrates from a safe distance. Second, he plans extensively, sometimes for weeks, building elaborate multi-step schemes in which each element depends on the one before it. Third, he exploits the trust and predictability of others, relying on his victims to behave in ways he can anticipate and use against them. Fourth, and perhaps most disturbingly, he transforms the moment of maximum suffering for the victim into a moment of maximum pleasure for himself. He does not merely want Scott to suffer, he wants to watch Scott suffer. He wants to taste it. Literally. These characteristics are consistent with what the FBI's Behavioral Rariuses Unit would describe as an organized offender profile. Organized offenders plan their crimes, they bring their own tools, they exercise control over the victim. They follow the crime closely, often returning to the scene or inserting themselves into the investigation. They take trophies or souvenirs, and they typically demonstrate above-average intelligence. Cartman fits this profile in nearly every particular. The only deviation is his age, which is, to put it mildly, an outlier. A forensic psychologist evaluating Cartman after the Scott Tenorman incident would likely administer the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, or its juvenile equivalent, the Antisocial Process Screening Device. The checklist measures traits such as superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, lack of remorse, shallow affect, callousness, failure to accept responsibility, and criminal versatility. Cartman scores high on virtually every dimension. His charm is superficial but effective, as demonstrated by his ability to deceive adults, manipulate peers, and rally groups to his cause. His grandiosity is legendary, his lying is pathological and frequent. His remorse is non-existent. His affect is shallow except when it comes to his own comfort and desires, about which he feels deeply and immediately. And his criminal versatility, as this entire Rare Rises demonstrates, is extraordinary. A forensic psychologist would almost certainly diagnose Cartman with conduct disorder with callous unemotional traits, which is the childhood precursor to antisocial personality disorder. This diagnosis does not constitute an insanity defense. It does not diminish criminal responsibility, but it would inform the court's assessment of Cartman's dangerousness and his likelihood of reoffending, both of which would be rated as extremely high. And if you are enjoying this so far, a quick subscribe really does help. It is completely free and it means we can keep making these long, quiet videos for you. That is all. Back to the case. The second major category of charges that would be filed against Eric Cartman involves what can broadly be described as biological warfare. That might sound like an exaggeration. It is not. In the first episode of the 12th season, Tonsil Trouble, which aired on March 12, 2008, Cartman contracts HIV through a contaminated blood transfusion during a routine tonsillectomy. The diagnosis itself is not his fault. What happens next is entirely his fault. When Kyle Broflovski laughs at Cartman's diagnosis, Cartman decides that Kyle deserves to share in his suffering, not through argument, not through social retaliation, through infection. Cartman draws his own blood using a syringe. He enlists the help of Butterscotch, who does not fully understand what is happening. He travels to Kyle's home under cover of darkness. He enters Kyle's bedroom while Kyle is asleep, and he drips his infected blood into Kyle's mouth. Kyle subsequently tests positive for HIV. The deliberateness of this act cannot be overstated. This is not an impulsive moment of anger. This is not a fight that escalates beyond what either party intended. This is a meticulously planned biological attack on another human being. Cartman obtained the materials, he prepared the blood, he recruited an accomplice. He timed the attack for when the victim would be unconscious and unable to resist. He administered the blood directly into Kyle's body, and he did all of this as punishment for being laughed at. In legal terms, the intentional transmission of HIV is a criminal offense in the majority of American states. More than 30 of the 50 states have prosecuted HIV-positive individuals for knowingly exposing another person to the virus. The specific statutes vary. In some states, it is charged as a standalone offense. In others, it is prosecuted as a form of assault. In still others, it can be elevated to attempted murder depending on the circumstances. But what makes Cartman's case particularly egregious is the method of transmission. He did not simply fail to disclose his status during consensual contact, which is the most common scenario in HIV transmission prosecutions. He actively and covertly introduced infected blood into the body of a sleeping child. There was no consent. There was no contact. There was no opportunity for the victim to protect himself. This elevates the offense beyond simple HIV transmission statutes into something far more serious. A prosecutor could reasonably charge this as assault with a deadly weapon, assault in the first degree, or attempted murder. In some jurisdictions, bodily fluids from an HIV-positive individual have been legally classified as a biological weapon. A case in Michigan involved a man charged under the state's anti-terrorism statute with possession of a biological weapon after he allegedly bit his neighbor, while HIV-positive. While that case was unusual, the underlying legal theory is not without precedent. If a prosecutor wanted to pursue the most aggressive charges possible, Cartman's deliberate infection of Kyle could be framed as the deployment of a biological agent as a weapon. Under federal law, specifically Title 18 U.S.C., Section 175, the use of a biological agent as a weapon carries a penalty of up to life imprisonment. The likelihood of such a charge being filed against a 10-year-old is admittedly vanishingly small, but the legal framework exists. The statute does not contain an age minimum, and the conduct viewed objectively involves the intentional introduction of a lethal pathogen into the body of an unwilling victim. That is, by definition, biological warfare. The fact that it is committed by a child in a cartoon does not change the legal raricis. It merely makes the raricis more disturbing. What makes this particular episode so revealing from a legal standpoint is that Cartman shows clear awareness that what he is doing is wrong. He sneaks into Kyle's room at night. He enlists an accomplice. He takes steps to avoid detection. He does not announce his intentions. He does not do it in public. He conceals the act and waits for Kyle to discover the results on his own. These are not the actions of someone who does not understand the nature of his conduct. Under the M'Naghten rule, which is the standard for criminal insanity in many American jurisdictions, including Colorado, a defendant is presumed sane unless they can prove that their mental state rendered them unable to know what they were doing, or unable to know that what they were doing was wrong. Cartman clearly knows what he is doing. He understands that infecting someone with HIV is harmful. He does it specifically because it is harmful. He does it as punishment. He takes pleasure in it. An insanity defense would be nearly impossible to sustain. There is another element of the tonsil trouble case that deserves attention, and it concerns the role of Butters Stotch as an accomplice. Butters assists Cartman in entering Kyle's home and administering the infected blood. The question of Butters' criminal liability is itself a fascinating sub-question. Butters does not fully understand what Cartman is doing. He is, as always, manipulated and deceived. Under the law, a person who participates in a crime without knowledge of its true nature may be shielded from liability by the defense of ignorance or mistake of fact. But Butters knows that they are sneaking into Kyle's home at night without permission. He knows that Cartman is doing something to Kyle while Kyle sleeps. He may not understand the specific nature of the act, but he understands that it is secretive, unauthorized, and potentially harmful. A prosecutor could charge Butters as an accomplice or accessory, though the charges would likely be reduced given his diminished understanding and the overwhelming evidence that he was manipulated by Cartman. This dynamic, Cartman using Butters as an unwitting tool, is itself a form of criminal exploitation that recurs throughout the series and adds additional charges to Cartman's ledger. The infection of Kyle with HIV also raises questions about victim restitution. Under both federal and state law, courts can order defendants to pay restitution to their victims for medical expenses, lost wages, and other costs associated with the crime. HIV treatment involves lifelong antiretroviral medication, regular medical monitoring, and potentially significant impacts on quality of life, employment, and personal relationships. The lifetime cost of HIV treatment in the United States has been estimated at hundreds of thousands of dollars. A restitution order in this case would be substantial, though collecting from a 10-year-old with no income or assets would be, as a practical matter, impossible. The third category of charges involves kidnapping and false imprisonment, and here the case practically builds itself. The evidence is overwhelming, the pattern is clear, and the most dramatic example has already become one of the most beloved episodes in the show's history, Casa Bonita. Season 7, Episode 11, originally airing in 2003. The premise is simple. Kyle Broflovsky plans a birthday trip to the restaurant Casa Bonita and invites Butters Stotch instead of Cartman. Cartman, who is desperate to attend, convinces Kyle that if Butters cannot go for any reason, Cartman can take his place. Kyle reluctantly agrees. This is the opening Cartman needs. What follows is a kidnapping operation that, for all its absurdity, hits every element of the legal definition with precision. Cartman tells Butters that an asteroid is about to strike Earth and that he needs to hide in Jimbo Kern's old bomb shelter for his own safety. Butters, trusting and chronically naive, complies. Cartman leaves him there. He seals the shelter. He goes to Casa Bonita, but the scheme does not end there because Butters eventually leaves the bomb shelter. Cartman relocates him to an abandoned gas station, locks him inside a broken refrigerator, and tells him that the surface has been overrun by radioactive cannibals. Butters believes him. A garbage truck eventually takes Butters, still inside the refrigerator, to the city dump. Butters emerges into what he believes is a post-apocalyptic wasteland. He finds a stray dog. He attempts to build a new civilization. The town of South Park searches for Butters for over a week. A missing child investigation is launched. Butters' parents are frantic. The community is mobilized. And Cartman is eating sopapillas at Casa Bonita, entirely unconcerned. A junkyard worker named Irene eventually discovers Butters and explains that no meteor ever struck, that the world is fine, and that Cartman deceived him. Butters calls his parents and then calls the police. Cartman is arrested at Casa Bonita, but only after enjoying the cliff divers and Black Bart's cave. His final act in the episode is to express satisfaction that he got to go to Casa Bonita, despite everything that is about to happen to him legally. The crime was worth it, in his estimation. That single detail tells a court everything it needs to know about this defendant's capacity for deterrence. Under federal kidnapping law, specifically 18 U.S.C. Section 1201, kidnapping involves the seizure, confinement, or abduction of a person against their will. While Butters initially enters the bomb shelter voluntarily, his consent is obtained through fraud and coercion. He does not consent to being imprisoned. He does not consent to being relocated to a refrigerator. He does not consent to being abandoned in a junkyard. He does not consent to spending over a week believing he is the last human being on Earth. The duration of the confinement, more than 7 days, is extreme. The psychological harm is severe. And the triggering of a community-wide missing persons search constitutes additional offenses, including filing a false police report by omission, since Cartman knows where Butters is and says nothing, and potentially obstruction of justice. Federal kidnapping carries a sentence of 20 years to life in prison. If the victim is a minor, as Butters is, the penalties are enhanced. Under Colorado state law, kidnapping in the first degree is a Class 1 felony, carrying the same maximum sentence as first-degree murder. False imprisonment, a lesser-included offense, still carries significant penalties. The emotional and psychological harm inflicted on Butters, a child who genuinely believed he was the sole surviving human for an extended period, would be a significant aggravating factor at sentencing. Any psychologist who evaluated Butters after this event would likely identify symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, and the resulting civil liability for Cartman, or more likely his mother, would be substantial. There is also a fascinating question about what charges could be brought against Cartman for the emotional and psychological harm inflicted on Butters' parents during the week-long search. Stephen and Linda Stotch believed their son was missing, possibly dead. They cooperated with law enforcement. They endured the agony of not knowing whether their child was alive. This anguish was entirely manufactured by Cartman, who knew where Butters was the entire time and said nothing. Under Colorado law, a person who knowingly causes another person severe emotional distress through extreme and outrageous conduct can be held civilly liable for intentional infliction of emotional distress. A criminal prosecution for this conduct could be framed as a form of psychological assault, or at minimum, as an aggravating factor in the kidnapping charges. The parents of a kidnapped child suffer their own form of victimization, and the legal system increasingly recognizes this. The Stotch family's suffering also raises questions about Cartman's understanding of empathy, or rather, his weaponization of its absence. He does not merely lack the ability to feel what others feel. He has developed the ability to predict what others feel without experiencing any corresponding emotional response himself. He knows that Butters' parents will be devastated. He knows that the town will be alarmed. He knows that a search will be launched. He factors all of these predictable responses into his plan and proceeds anyway, because the emotional suffering of others is simply not a variable that enters his calculations. A forensic psychologist would describe this as a deficit in effective empathy combined with intact cognitive empathy, which is one of the hallmarks of psychopathy. Cartman can model the emotional states of others with impressive accuracy. He simply does not care about them. But Casa Bonita is not an isolated incident. It is part of a pattern, and patterns matter enormously in criminal law, both because they demonstrate a propensity for certain types of conduct, and because they can be used to enhance sentencing under habitual offender statutes. In the second episode of the 9th season, Die Hippie Die, which aired on March 16, 2005, Cartman imprisons 63 hippies in his basement. He operates what amounts to a private detention facility, holding people against their will for an indeterminate period because he considers them a social nuisance. Officer Barbrady discovers the imprisoned hippies and arrests Cartman, one of the rare occasions where he actually faces legal consequences within the show. 63 counts of false imprisonment. Each count is a potential felony. The cumulative sentence, if served consecutively, would be measured in decades. The 9th episode of the 9th season, Ginger Kids, escalates the pattern dramatically. After being made to believe he has become a ginger kid, Cartman forms the Ginger Separatist movement. He abducts dozens of non-ginger children. He cages them in the Sunset Room at the Airport Hilton. He arranges for a pit of lava to be installed. And he orders the systematic execution of the captive children, beginning with Kyle, whom he designates as a daywalker. This is attempted mass murder. This is a hate crime, motivated by a perceived physical characteristic. And the organized, systematic nature of the abductions, the detention, and the planned executions meets the federal definition of domestic terrorism under 18 U.S.C. Section 2331. The fact that the plan is stopped before anyone dies does not eliminate criminal liability. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, hate crime enhancements, and terrorism charges. Each carries its own sentence. Together, they represent centuries of incarceration. If you are settling in and finding this the kind of thing you could listen to for a while, subscribing to the channel is the single best way to support what we do here. It is free and it takes less than 5 seconds. That is it. Now, back to the matter at hand. The fourth category of charges involves fraud, and this is where Cartman's criminal versatility truly becomes remarkable. He is not merely a violent offender. He is a white-collar criminal of extraordinary sophistication, at least for someone who has not yet entered middle school. The list of fraudulent schemes is long enough to fill its own case file, and each one demonstrates a different facet of Cartman's manipulative intelligence. The most consequential fraud occurs in the 13th episode of the 5th season, Kenny Dies, which aired on December 5, 2001. Cartman discovers a truckload of aborted fetuses that were being transported for disposal. Rather than report this discovery or simply walk away, he seizes the fetuses and begins calling research companies, hoping to sell them for profit. When the government bans stem cell research, cutting off his revenue stream, Cartman pivots with remarkable speed. He travels to Washington, D.C. He stands before the United States House of Representatives. He delivers an impassioned, tearful speech about how his best friend Kenny McCormick is dying of a terminal illness, and how lifting the ban on stem cell research might save Kenny's life. He sings Asia's heat of the moment. The House is moved. The ban is lifted. Stem cell research resumes. But Cartman never intended to save Kenny. His actual goal, revealed in the episode's final moments, was to use the stem cells to clone a Shakey's Pizza restaurant. Kenny dies. Cartman gets his pizza. And the United States Congress has been manipulated by a 9-year-old. The fraud here operates on multiple levels and implicates multiple federal statutes. Fraud upon the United States Congress is a serious federal offense. Cartman testified before a congressional committee using false pretenses, emotional manipulation, and outright lies to influence legislative action. This could be prosecuted under 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, which criminalizes making false statements to federal officials, with penalties of up to 5 years per count. It could also be prosecuted as wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, which carries penalties of up to 20 years. And the underlying scheme, the acquisition, transportation, and attempted sale of biological materials, implicates a separate set of federal regulations governing the handling of human tissue, with violations carrying both civil and criminal penalties. The exploitation of Kenny's death is not merely a moral failing. It is evidence of criminal intent. Cartman used a dying child, his own friend, as a prop in a fraud scheme. The willingness to exploit the death of a person he allegedly cares about in order to obtain a pizza restaurant demonstrates a calculus of self-interest so extreme that it borders on the clinical. A forensic psychologist reviewing this case would likely identify it as a textbook example of callous, unemotional traits, which are a subset of conduct disorder in children and a precursor to antisocial personality disorder in adults. In another episode, the 12th episode of the 4th season, titled probably, Cartman starts his own church. This is not a passing fancy. He establishes a functioning religious organization. He recruits the children of South Park as evangelists. He holds services. He collects donations. He delivers sermons, and the money, every dollar of it, goes directly into his own pocket. This is textbook embezzlement and mail fraud. Under Colorado law, embezzlement is generally prosecuted as a form of theft, with penalties scaled to the amount stolen. If Cartman collected more than $20,000, which is plausible given the scale of his operation, the charge rises to a Class 3 felony, carrying 4 to 12 years in prison. The church fraud is particularly noteworthy because it demonstrates Cartman's understanding of institutional structures and how to exploit them. He does not simply steal from individuals. He creates an institution, gives it legitimacy, and then siphons resources from within it. This is the methodology of a white-collar criminal, not a street thug. It requires organizational skills, public speaking ability, and an understanding of how people respond to authority, particularly religious authority. A 10-year-old who can establish a church, recruit a congregation, and embezzle its funds is not a child who lacks the capacity to understand the nature of his actions. He is a child who understands it completely. Then there is the matter of disability fraud. In the 2nd episode of the 8th season, Up the Down Steroid, which aired on March 24th, 2004, Cartman learns that the Special Olympics offers a $1,000 cash prize to its winners. He disguises himself as a person with intellectual disabilities and enters the competition of easy victory. This constitutes fraud against a charitable organization. It constitutes identity fraud, as Cartman creates a false identity and a fabricated disability to gain entry. And while the dollar amount is small, the moral dimension of the offense, defrauding an organization that serves people with disabilities, would be treated as an aggravating factor by any sentencing judge. The irony of the episode is that Cartman loses badly, because the actual Special Olympics athletes are far more athletic than he is. But in criminal law, the outcome does not determine liability. The attempt is what matters. Conspiracy to commit fraud does not require that the fraud succeed. Credit card fraud appears in multiple episodes and demonstrates a casual, almost habitual relationship with financial crime. In Fatbeard, The 7th episode of the 13th season, which aired on April 22, 2009, Cartman steals his mother's credit card to purchase airline tickets to Somalia for himself and several other children, intending to become a pirate. The unauthorized use of another person's credit card is a crime in every jurisdiction in the United States. Under federal law, credit card fraud carries penalties of up to 15 years in prison per count. Cartman purchases multiple tickets, meaning multiple counts are in play. And the purpose of the travel, international piracy, adds an entirely separate dimension of criminal liability that we will address shortly. He also uses his mother's credit card in other episodes for purposes ranging from purchasing items online to renting electric scooters. Each unauthorized use is a separate offense. The pattern demonstrates not only a disregard for property rights, but also an understanding that credit cards are instruments of financial power and a willingness to exploit them without hesitation. There is yet another layer of fraud that deserves attention, and it comes from the 13th episode of the 8th season, Cartman's Incredible Gift, which aired on December 8, 2004. After falling from his roof while attempting to fly with cardboard wings, Cartman suffers a severe head injury and falls into a coma. When he wakes, he coincidentally guesses the color of a doctor's tie correctly, and the South Park police become convinced that Cartman possesses psychic abilities. Rather than correct the misunderstanding, Cartman leans into it. He allows the police to bring him to active crime scenes. He identifies suspects based on nothing more than his personal grudges and prejudices. He frames innocent people for murders they did not commit. And he does all of this while a real serial killer, Michael Dietz, continues to operate undetected. The legal implications of this are substantial and layered. First, impersonating a psychic consultant and providing false information to law enforcement constitutes obstruction of justice, a crime that can be charged as either a misdemeanor or a felony depending on the severity. Second, knowingly identifying innocent people as murder suspects constitutes defamation, malicious prosecution, and potentially conspiracy to deprive those individuals of their civil rights. Third, the fact that Cartman's fraudulent psychic consulting actively impedes the investigation of a real serial killer means that any additional victims who die while the police are following Cartman's false leads could arguably be attributed, in part, to Cartman's obstruction. A prosecutor could argue that Cartman's interference was a proximate cause of subsequent harm, though this would be a difficult argument to sustain in practice. The psychic fraud also raises an interesting First Amendment question. Psychic services have generally been protected as free speech in the United States, and many states have repealed or declined to enforce old fortune-telling statutes. But this protection applies to psychic services offered as entertainment or spiritual guidance. When someone represents themselves as a psychic to law enforcement and uses that representation to influence criminal investigations, the First Amendment protections fall away. This is not protected speech. This is fraud in furtherance of obstruction of justice. The About Last Night episode, the 12th episode of the 12th season, which aired on November 5, 2008, adds burglary and theft to the ledger. On the night of the 2008 presidential election, as the residents of South Park are either celebrating or despairing over the results, Cartman takes advantage of the chaos to break into multiple homes and steal television sets. He then sells the stolen televisions for profit. This constitutes burglary, which in Colorado is a Class 2 or Class 3 felony depending on whether the building entered is a dwelling, and theft, which is graded based on the value of the property stolen. Multiple counts of burglary and theft committed across multiple homes in a single night demonstrate both opportunity-based criminality and an understanding of how social upheaval creates windows for illegal activity. Cartman does not wait for opportunities. He recognizes them and he exploits them with speed and efficiency. In Obama Wins, the 14th episode of the 16th season, which aired on November 7, 2012, Cartman steals voting ballots from polling stations in multiple swing states during the presidential election. He masquerades as an unassuming child to deceive elderly poll workers and smuggles the ballots out of the stations. The theft and destruction of voting ballots constitutes election fraud, a federal crime under multiple statutes including 18 U.S.C. Section 594, which prohibits intimidation of voters, and 52 U.S.C. Section 20511, which criminalizes the knowing and willful deprivation of voting rights. Stealing ballots from multiple states introduces additional federal jurisdiction, as the crime crosses state lines and involves interference with a federal election. The penalties for election fraud can include fines and imprisonment of up to 5 years per count. But the symbolic weight of the offense is what makes it extraordinary. A 10-year-old boy single-handedly undermining the democratic process of the most powerful nation on earth. The audacity of the scheme is surpassed only by its implications. There is one more fraud scheme that warrants detailed examination before moving on, and it comes from a place that one might not initially associate with criminal law. The pandemic episodes, the 10th and 11th episodes of the 12th season, which aired in October 2008, feature Cartman convincing the boys to form a Peruvian flute band as a money-making scheme. He recruits Craig Tucker, convincing him to invest his $100 birthday money as venture capital. The scheme involves fraud against the public, who believe they are watching a genuine Peruvian musical act, and fraud against Craig, whose investment is obtained under false pretenses. While the monetary stakes are relatively small, the pattern is familiar. Cartman identifies an opportunity. He recruits others by deceiving them about the nature and risks of the enterprise. He positions himself to receive the lion's share of any profits while exposing his partners to the bulk of the risk. And when things go wrong, as they inevitably do, Cartman is the last person to accept responsibility and the first person to assign blame. This pattern of recruitment through deception is itself a criminal act. Under the law of fraud, a person who obtains money or services through material misrepresentation commits theft by deception. Craig's $100 was obtained through Cartman's misrepresentation of the business opportunity. The other boy's labor was obtained through similar misrepresentations. And the audience's money, to the extent any was collected, was obtained through the misrepresentation that the boys were a legitimate musical act. Each transaction is a separate count of fraud. The concept of a Ponzi scheme, while not directly applicable, is worth mentioning in the context of Cartman's broader financial crimes. A Ponzi scheme involves using funds from new investors to pay returns to earlier investors, creating the illusion of legitimate profit while the organizer siphons off funds. While Cartman has never run a classical Ponzi scheme, his financial crimes share many of the same characteristics. He creates the appearance of legitimate enterprise. He recruits participants with promises of returns. He diverts the proceeds to himself. And the entire structure depends on deception, because if any of the participants knew the truth, they would never have participated. This is the architecture of financial fraud, executed with remarkable consistency by a person who has not yet reached the age at which most children receive their first allowance. The fifth category sits at the intersection of criminal law and international law, and that is the charge of terrorism. Applying the word terrorism to the actions of a fictional 10-year-old might seem excessive, but the legal definition of terrorism is not limited to the acts that dominate news headlines. Under federal law, specifically 18 U.S.C. Section 2331, domestic terrorism involves acts that are dangerous to human life, that violate federal or state criminal laws, and that appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. Several of Cartman's schemes meet this definition precisely. The Ginger Separatist movement discussed earlier is one example, but the Cthulhu arc in Season 14, in the 12th and 13th episodes, Mysterion Rises and Coon vs. Coon and Friends, which aired in November 2010, Cartman, operating under his superhero persona, the Coon, forges an alliance with the Lovecraftian deity Cthulhu. Together, they embark on a campaign of destruction that targets specific communities and institutions. They attack a synagogue, they destroy San Francisco, they target Whole Food stores, they attack hippie gatherings. The pattern is not random. Cartman selects targets based on his personal prejudices and directs Cthulhu, an entity of immense destructive power, to carry out attacks against them. In legal terms, this is incitement to violence, conspiracy to commit arson, conspiracy to commit murder, destruction of religious property, which is a federal hate crime under 18 U.S.C., Section 247, and acts of terrorism under the federal definition. The fact that the instrument of destruction is a fictional elder god rather than a conventional weapon does not change the legal reruses. Cartman directed the attacks, he chose the targets, he acted with specific intent to destroy property and endanger lives. The law does not require that the weapon be conventional. It requires that the defendant act with criminal intent, and Cartman's intent is never ambiguous. He is explicit about what he wants destroyed and why. The Passion of the Jew, the third episode of the 8th season, which aired on March 31, 2004, adds yet another layer. After viewing Mel Gibson's film The Passion of the Christ, Cartman organizes what is effectively a neo-Nazi rally. He dresses in attire reminiscent of Adolf Hitler. He forms a fan club for the film that functions as a vehicle for anti-Semitic propaganda. He leads the townspeople of South Park in a march through the streets, shouting slogans in German, performing the Nazi goose-step, and chanting phrases that the participants believe are Aramaic, but are actually German-language hate speech. Cartman knows exactly what he is doing. He has orchestrated the entire event to advance his anti-Semitic ideology under the cover of religious appreciation. Under federal hate crime law, specifically 18 U.S.C., Section 249, crimes motivated by bias against a victim's religion carry enhanced federal penalties of up to 10 years in prison, or life imprisonment if the crime results in death. Cartman's anti-Semitic activities are not isolated incidents. They constitute a pattern of conduct that spans the entire series, from his very first appearances to his most recent ones. He has repeatedly and explicitly expressed the desire to exterminate Jewish people. He has organized groups dedicated to this purpose. He has used deception, manipulation, and institutional structures to advance this agenda. In a real prosecution, the entirety of this pattern would be presented as evidence of a sustained, ideologically motivated campaign of hate, and it would result in significant sentencing enhancements under federal guidelines, which allow courts to impose longer sentences when a crime is motivated by bias. And if you are still here, and if this is the kind of long measured raricist that helps you wind down, subscribing really is the simplest way to help us keep going. It costs nothing, and it ensures these videos keep appearing in your feed. That is the only ask. Now, let us continue. The sixth category involves crimes against vulnerable populations, and this is where the case against Cartman becomes genuinely difficult to discuss, even in the abstract. The Crack Baby Athletic Association, the 5th episode of the 15th season, which aired on May 25th, 2011, is one of the most disturbing schemes Cartman has ever conceived. He volunteers at a hospital that treats babies born addicted to crack cocaine. He observes the infants, and he devises a plan to exploit them for profit. Cartman takes the addicted infants, gives them small amounts of crack cocaine, and films them fighting over the drug. He broadcasts the footage on the internet. He monetizes the content. He establishes an entire organization, the Crack Baby Athletic Association, or CBAA, to formalize the operation. He recruits Kyle Broflovsky to help manage the enterprise. He even attempts to negotiate a deal with EA Sports to create a video game based on the concept. The episode is a satire of the NCAA and its exploitation of college athletes, drawing parallels between the way unpaid college athletes generate billions in revenue for universities and the way Cartman's crack babies generate revenue for his organization. But taken on its own terms, stripped of satirical context, Cartman's actions constitute a staggering array of criminal offenses. Child abuse, child endangerment, distribution of a controlled substance to minors, exploitation of minors, production and distribution of exploitative content involving minors, potentially human trafficking if the babies were removed from the hospital without authorization. Each of these charges carries severe penalties. Child abuse in Colorado is a Class 2 felony when it results in serious bodily injury, carrying a sentence of 8 to 24 years. Distribution of controlled substances to a minor carries enhanced penalties under both state and federal law, and the commercial nature of the enterprise, the fact that Cartman is building a business on the exploitation of addicted infants, would be treated as an extraordinarily aggravating circumstance by any court in the country. This is not a child who stole a candy bar. This is a child who created a commercial enterprise based on the physical abuse of newborns. The 7th category concerns Cartman's sustained campaign of psychological abuse, harassment, and criminal victimization against a single individual. And that individual is Leopold Butters Stotch. Butters is, by any measure, Cartman's primary and most frequently victimized target. Not his most dramatically victimized, perhaps, given what happened to Scott Tenorman. But Butters is the person Cartman returns to again and again, episode after episode, season after season, as a tool, a target, and the source of cruel amusement. The legal concept of a course of conduct is important here. A single act of manipulation or harassment might be treated as an isolated incident, but when the same perpetrator targets the same victim repeatedly over an extended period, the legal framework shifts. It becomes stalking, which is a felony in Colorado. It becomes a pattern of harassment, and it becomes powerful evidence of a predatory disposition, which is highly relevant at sentencing. The Casa Bonita kidnapping is part of this pattern, but there are many other examples and each one adds weight to the overall case. In Cartman Sucks, the 2nd episode of the 11th season, which aired on March 14, 2007, Cartman photographs himself with Butters in a sexually explicit and compromising position while Butters is asleep. He shows the photograph to other children. When Kyle points out that the photograph actually reflects worse on Cartman than on Butters, Cartman panics and attempts to create a second photograph by tricking Butters into a similar position. He enters Butters' home. He blindfolds Butters, and he attempts to place his body in contact with Butters' mouth before being discovered by Butters' father, Stephen. The legal implications are severe. The creation of sexually explicit images of a minor is a federal crime under 18 U.S.C. Section 2251, carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years and a maximum of 30 years for a first offense. The distribution of such images, which Cartman does when he shows the photograph to other children at school, carries additional penalties under 18 U.S.C. Section 2252. And the attempted sexual contact, the attempt to place his body against Butters' mouth while Butters is blindfolded and unable to see what is happening, constitutes sexual assault regardless of the ages of the parties involved. The fact that both the perpetrator and the victim are minors complicates the prosecution but does not eliminate criminal liability. Juvenile courts regularly adjudicate cases involving sexual offenses between minors. There is another dimension to the Butters victimization pattern that a prosecutor would explore with particular interest, and it concerns the episode Bass to Mouth, the 10th episode of the 15th season, which aired on October 19, 2011. In this episode, Cartman engineers one of his most elaborate and wide-reaching acts of cruelty, one that extends well beyond Butters and affects the entire student body of South Park Elementary. The scheme begins when a student named Pete Melman defecates in his pants during class, an incident that becomes the subject of widespread ridicule. The school administration grows alarmed because a year earlier, another student named Corey Duran suffered a similar humiliation, and Cartman led a campaign of mockery and torment against Duran that was so severe, the boy ultimately took his own life. The administration fears a repeat tragedy and enlists Cartman to help defuse the situation, a decision that ranks among the most catastrophically misguided in the history of educational administration. Cartman responds by baking cupcakes laced with laxatives and giving them to another student, Jenny Simons, causing her to suffer the same humiliation as Pete. His logic, if it can be called that, is that spreading the embarrassment to additional victims will somehow reduce the stigma for the original victim. When this plan predictably backfires, Cartman escalates. He devises a plan to reward the student body for their state exam scores with a pizza party. The pizza is laced with laxatives and Arby's horsey sauce. The intended result is that every student in the school will defecate in their pants simultaneously, thereby eliminating the stigma through universality. The legal rarity of this scheme is dense and deeply troubling. The lacing of food with laxatives constitutes food tampering, which is a federal offense under the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, 18 U.S.C. Section 1365. The statute criminalizes the intentional contamination or adulteration of food products with the intent to cause serious bodily harm, and it carries penalties of up to 10 years in prison. The fact that Cartman's intent is not to cause serious bodily harm per se, but to cause widespread humiliation, does not eliminate liability under the tampering statute. The introduction of any foreign substance into food without the knowledge or consent of the consumer constitutes tampering regardless of the specific intent behind it. But the food tampering is only the beginning. The administration of laxatives to dozens of children without their knowledge or consent constitutes assault and battery against each individual victim. Each student who consumes the tainted food represents a separate count. If 30 students eat the pizza, that is 30 counts of assault. If 50 students eat it, that is 50 counts. The number of victims in this single scheme could exceed anything Cartman has previously achieved in a single episode, with the possible exception of the NASCAR incident. There is also the matter of Corey Duran. The show establishes that Cartman's prior campaign of ridicule against Duran's death, while a direct prosecution for causing Duran's death through bullying would be legally complex, the precedent is not without foundation. Several states have enacted anti-bullying laws that impose criminal liability on individuals whose sustained harassment contributes to a victim's suicide. These laws are relatively new and their application is still evolving, but the underlying principle is clear. When a person engages in a sustained campaign of psychological torment against a vulnerable individual, and that campaign contributes to the individual's death, the tormentor bears a degree of legal responsibility for the outcome. The fact that Cartman not only escapes accountability for Duran's death but is then entrusted by the school to prevent a recurrence demonstrates an institutional failure so profound that it would itself generate significant civil liability for the school. District. The Bass to Mouth episode also introduces the question of food safety regulations and the liability of individuals who compromise them in institutional settings. Schools have a legal obligation to ensure the safety of the food they serve to students. When Cartman manipulates the school into serving contaminated food, both Cartman and the school administrators who cooperate become liable under food safety statutes, negligence theories, and potentially criminal conspiracy charges. The administrators who agree to Cartman's plan are not merely negligent. They are active participants in a scheme to administer a harmful substance to children. Each of them could face individual criminal charges, and the school district would face civil liability on a massive scale. What makes this episode particularly significant in the context of the broader case is that it demonstrates Cartman's ability to corrupt institutions from within. He does not merely commit crimes against individuals. He infiltrates the institutional structures that are supposed to protect those individuals and turns those structures into instruments of harm. The school administration becomes his accomplice. The pizza party, an event designed to celebrate academic achievement, becomes a vehicle for mass assault. The institutional framework of the school, its authority, its resources, its access to the student body, is hijacked by a 10-year-old and repurposed for cruelty. This pattern of institutional corruption recurs throughout Cartman's criminal career, from his manipulation of Congress to his exploitation of the church to his infiltration of the KFC cartel. He does not merely break rules, he takes over the systems that make rules and bends them to serve his purposes. The pattern extends further. In the Pink Eye episode, the 7th episode of the first season, which aired on October 29, 1997, before Cartman had even established himself as the show's primary antagonist, he arrives at school wearing an Adolf Hitler costume for Halloween. When Principal Victoria removes the costume and attempts to dress him as a ghost, the resulting outfit inadvertently resembles a Ku Klux Klan member's robes. This is played for comedy in the context of the episode, but it establishes a pattern of white supremacist imagery and ideology that runs throughout the entire series. In a real school setting, a student repeatedly wearing Nazi or white supremacist imagery would trigger disciplinary action, potentially including suspension or expulsion, and would likely result in a referral to law enforcement and social services. The fact that South Park Elementary takes no meaningful action is part of the institutional failure that enables Cartman's escalating behavior. In the episode Jared Has AIDS, Cartman impersonates Butters on the telephone and makes prank calls to Butters' parents, causing them to believe their son has been misbehaving in ways that warrant physical punishment. As a direct result, Butters' parents physically beat their son. Cartman knows this will happen. He has observed the Stotch family's dynamics. He understands that Butters' parents are prone to disproportionate punishment, and he deliberately triggers that punishment as a form of entertainment for himself. In legal terms, this could be prosecuted as contributing to child abuse, reckless endangerment of a minor, or accessory to assault. Cartman's phone calls are the proximate cause of the physical harm. Butters suffers. Without those calls, the beating does not occur. The causal chain is direct and unbroken. In the 5th episode of the 8th season, Awesome O, which aired on April 14, 2004, Cartman disguises himself as a robot, AWESOM, -04000, and infiltrates Butters' daily life with the specific intent of extracting embarrassing personal secrets that he can later use for blackmail. Blackmail and extortion are felonies under both Colorado state law and federal law. The fact that Cartman's scheme ultimately backfires because Butters possesses a compromising video of Cartman dancing in a Britney Spears costume does not diminish the criminal intent behind the deception. Cartman conceived, planned, and executed a scheme to obtain information through deception for the purpose of coercing another person. That is extortion. The failure to achieve the desired outcome does not transform the crime. It transforms it into an attempted crime, which carries its own penalties. There is another dimension to the Cartman-Butters dynamic that any defense attorney would try to exploit, and that any prosecutor would try to contextualize. Butters keeps coming back. Despite being kidnapped, deceived, manipulated, physically endangered, sexually humiliated, and psychologically traumatized, Butters continues to interact with Cartman, to trust him, and to participate in his schemes. A defense attorney might argue that this suggests the harm is not as severe as the prosecution claims, or that Butters is a willing participant rather than a victim. But this argument misunderstands the psychology of abuse. Victims of sustained abuse often return to their abusers. They normalize the abuse. They blame themselves. They develop trauma bonds. Butters' continued engagement with Cartman is not evidence that the abuse is benign. It is evidence that the abuse has been effective. It is evidence that Cartman has successfully broken down Butters' ability to protect himself. And in a courtroom, a psychologist would explain this in terms that would make the pattern even more damning, not less. The 8th category takes us into the realm of international criminal law, and specifically to the charge of piracy. In Fatbeard, the 7th episode of the 13th season, which aired on April 22, 2009, Cartman misinterprets news reports about Somali piracy and decides that real-life pirating, the kind involving ships and plunder and parrots, has made a comeback. He recruits several other children, including Butters, Kevin, Ike Broflovsky, and Clyde, steals his mother's credit card to buy plane tickets, and travels to Mogadishu, Somalia. Once there, he attempts to organize actual Somali pirates into a traditional pirating operation, complete with eye patches, pirate flags, and treasure maps. Under international law, piracy is one of the oldest and most universally condemned crimes in existence. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea defines piracy as any illegal act of violence, detention, or depredation committed for private ends by the crew or passengers of a private ship or aircraft against another ship or aircraft. Under United States federal law, 18 U.S.C. Section 1651 provides that whoever, on the high seas, commits the crime of piracy as defined by the law of nations shall be imprisoned for life. That is not a maximum sentence. That is the sentence. Life imprisonment. Mandatory. No judicial discretion. The fact that Cartman is a 10-year-old American child who traveled to East Africa to engage in maritime piracy does not change the legal definition of the crime. It does, however, make the case one of the most unusual in the history of maritime jurisprudence. The additional offenses stack rapidly: credit card fraud for the plane tickets, child endangerment for bringing other minors into a war zone, contributing to the delinquency of minors, as several of the children Cartman recruits are younger than he is, international travel in furtherance of criminal enterprise, conspiracy to commit piracy, and the potential involvement with actual Somali pirate organizations raises questions about material support for criminal enterprises, which is itself a federal offense carrying up to 15 years in prison. If you have been here for a while and this is the kind of deep, thorough raresis that appeals to you, then subscribing is genuinely the best thing you can do to support this channel. It is free, it takes 2 seconds, and it means more than you might imagine. Now, back to the case. The 9th category concerns Cartman's relationship with direct physical violence, and the way the law would assess his propensity for assault, battery, and attempted murder across multiple episodes. In the 8th episode of the 14th season, Poor and Stupid, which aired on October 6, 2010, Cartman decides he wants to become a NASCAR driver. He hijacks a race car at an actual NASCAR event and drives it around the track at high speed, recklessly and without any training. He runs over multiple spectators and pit crew members. According to the episode, 11 people die as a result of his actions. 11 deaths. 11 counts of vehicular homicide at minimum. The legal classification depends on Cartman's mental state at the time. If he was aware that driving a race car into a crowd of people could cause death, and he did it anyway, the charge is depraved heart murder, sometimes called depraved indifference murder, which is a form of second-degree murder. In Colorado, second-degree murder is a Class 2 felony, carrying a sentence of 8 to 24 years for each count. 11 counts, served consecutively, would mean between 88 and 264 years in prison. And that is before adding charges for vehicle theft, reckless driving, reckless endangerment, destruction of property, and trespassing. Consider for a moment the scale of the NASCAR incident in purely numerical terms. 11 deaths in a single event. In the real world, a mass casualty event of this magnitude would dominate national news coverage for weeks. It would trigger investigations by local law enforcement, state police, the FBI, and the National Transportation Safety Board. It would result in congressional hearings. It would produce changes in event security protocols across the country. It would generate hundreds of civil lawsuits against the event organizers, the track, the car manufacturers, and any other entity that could be argued to have contributed to the tragedy. And the perpetrator, even if they were a child, would face the full weight of the criminal justice system. The idea that a 10-year-old could kill 11 people at a public event and face no lasting consequences is, in the real world, inconceivable. But in South Park, it is simply another Wednesday. The vehicular homicides also raise questions about the legal concept of transferred intent. Cartman may not have specifically intended to kill the 11 people who died. He intended to drive a race car, and he drove it recklessly. But under the doctrine of transferred intent, if a defendant intends to commit an act that is inherently dangerous to human life, and that act results in the death of another person, the defendant's intent transfers from the intended act to the resulting death. Cartman intended to drive a stolen race car at high speed in a crowded venue. He knew, or should have known, that this was inherently dangerous. The deaths that resulted from this inherently dangerous act are therefore treated as intentional killings for purposes of criminal liability. This is the foundation of depraved heart murder, and it is one of the most straightforward legal theories available to a prosecutor. In Toilet Paper, the 3rd episode of the 7th season, which aired on April 2, 2003, Cartman makes his most direct and unambiguous attempt at murder within his own friend group. After the boys toilet paper their art teacher's house, Kyle begins experiencing guilt and considers confessing. Cartman, who does not want Kyle to confess because it would implicate all of them, he takes Kyle out on a boat ride on Stark's Pond. a direct reference to the assassination scene in The Godfather Part 2, where Michael Corleone has his brother Fredo taken out on a fishing trip to be killed. Cartman's weapon of choice is a wiffle bat, which is the only instrument he can afford. The attack fails because a wiffle bat is not a lethal weapon. Cartman then attempts to kill all 3 of his friends using the same wiffle bat, and again fails. The incompetence of the execution does not negate the intent. Attempted murder does not require that the attempt be competent. It requires that the defendant take a substantial step toward killing another person with the intent to cause death. Cartman took Kyle onto a boat under false pretenses with a weapon, intending to kill him. That is attempted murder. The fact that the weapon was inadequate is a failure of execution, not a failure of intent. In Best Friends Forever, the 4th episode of the 9th season, which aired on March 30th, 2005, Cartman lobbies to have Kenny McCormick's feeding tube removed while Kenny is in a vegetative state. His motivation is entirely selfish. Kenny's will bequeaths his new PlayStation Portable to Cartman, but the bequest is only effective upon Kenny's death. While Kenny remains alive on life support, Cartman does not receive the PSP, so Cartman campaigns for the removal of the feeding tube, a course of action that would directly result in Kenny's death. The episode parodies the Terry Schiavo case, and it won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program in 2005. But viewed through a legal lens, Cartman's advocacy for removing the feeding tube, motivated entirely by his desire to obtain a gaming console, constitutes attempted murder by solicitation. He is trying to convince medical professionals and legal authorities to take an action that will kill his friend, not for any medical or compassionate reason, but so he can play video games. The callousness is almost incomprehensible, and yet it is entirely consistent with Cartman's established pattern of treating other human beings as obstacles to be removed, when they stand between him and something he wants. In the 7th episode of the 10th season, Psst, which aired on May 3, 2006, Cartman's behavior reaches a point where his own mother, Leanne Cartman, hires professional help to control him. A series of reality television nannies are brought in, and each one is psychologically destroyed by Cartman. One ends up in a mental institution feeding on her own feces, after Cartman's sustained campaign of manipulation and cruelty. Finally, Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer, applies canine behavioral techniques to Cartman, and for a brief period, the techniques work. Cartman becomes compliant, polite, and seemingly reformed. But in the episode's final moments, Leanne, unable to maintain the discipline required, offers Cartman whatever he wants. His behavioral patterns return instantly. He smiles, ominous music plays. The reformation was never real. It was a performance sustained only by external pressure, and abandoned the moment that pressure was removed. This episode matters legally for 2 reasons. First, it demonstrates that Cartman is capable of modifying his behavior when properly motivated. This means a defense attorney cannot argue that he is constitutionally incapable of conforming his conduct to legal requirements. He can conform, he simply chooses not to, and choices carry consequences. Second, the episode demonstrates that Cartman's psychological destruction of the nannies is deliberate and effective. He does not merely resist their efforts. He actively targets their vulnerabilities, exploits their insecurities, and breaks them psychologically. This is not the behavior of a child acting out. This is the behavior of a sophisticated psychological operator who identifies and exploits weaknesses in others. In a courtroom, this evidence would be devastating. It would demonstrate that Cartman possesses the capacity to cause profound psychological harm to adults, that he does so intentionally, and that he derives satisfaction from the result. The 10th category of legal rearises involves what a defense attorney would actually do with this case, because even the most apparently hopeless defendant is entitled to a defense, and the defense of Eric Cartman, while difficult, is not impossible. The starting point for any defense would be the age of the defendant. Cartman is 10 years old. Under the 8th Amendment to the United States Constitution, as interpreted by the Supreme Court in a series of landmark decisions, children are constitutionally different from adults for purposes of sentencing. In Roper v. Simmons decided in 2005, the court ruled that the 8th Amendment prohibits the execution of individuals who were under 18 at the time of their crime. The reasoning was that juveniles are less culpable than adults because their brains are still developing, because they are more susceptible to negative environmental influences, and because their character is not yet fully formed. In Graham v. Florida, decided in 2010, the court extended this reasoning to hold that juvenile offenders who have not committed homicide cannot be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And in Miller v. Alabama, decided in 2012, the court went further still, ruling that mandatory life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders, even those convicted of homicide, are unconstitutional. The court held that sentencing courts must consider the individual characteristics of the juvenile defendant. including their age, their maturity, their family and home environment, and their capacity for rehabilitation. A defense attorney representing Eric Cartman would lean heavily on these precedents. The argument would be that Cartman is a child, that his brain is not fully developed, that the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, judgment, and the ability to foresee consequences, does not fully mature until approximately age 25. That whatever Cartman has done, he did as a child whose capacity for moral reasoning is still forming, that the law recognizes this diminished culpability and requires that it be reflected in the sentence. The defense would also emphasize Cartman's environment. His father was absent for the entire duration of his childhood, and later revealed to have been murdered by Cartman himself, albeit unknowingly. His mother, Leon Cartman, is spectacularly permissive, enabling her son's worst behavior while providing no structure, no discipline, and no meaningful emotional support. The defense would argue that Cartman is in part a product of parental neglect, that his behavioral patterns are a predictable consequence of being raised without limits, without accountability, and without a stable adult presence. The doctrine of parental liability, while not a defense to criminal charges in itself, provides a framework for arguing that the culpability should be shared. Leanne Cartman knew her son was dangerous. She saw the evidence, she was told by professionals, and she consistently chose to enable rather than restrain him. The defense might also argue that Cartman has never received adequate mental health treatment. Despite displaying symptoms consistent with conduct disorder, narcissistic personality traits, and callous unemotional traits from an early age, no mental health professional has ever been assigned to work with him on a sustained basis. The school system has failed to identify and intervene with a clearly at-risk child. The community has failed to report obvious signs of criminal behavior. The defense would argue that punishing Cartman for behavior that the entire system around him failed to address is, at best, incomplete justice. There is another dimension to the defense that merits exploration, and it is the question of proportionality. The Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and the Supreme Court has interpreted this prohibition to include sentences that are grossly disproportionate to the offense. A defense attorney would argue that sentencing a 10-year-old to hundreds or thousands of years in prison, even for crimes of this magnitude, violates the proportionality principle. The argument would be that no child, regardless of what they have done, should be condemned to die in prison because doing so denies the possibility of redemption. And the possibility of redemption is what separates a civilized justice system from a system of vengeance. This is a powerful argument, and it is one that the Supreme Court has been sympathetic to in recent years. The decisions in Roper, Graham, and Miller all reflect a growing recognition that children occupy a different moral universe than adults, and that the law must account for that difference even when the child's crimes are horrific. But there is a counter-argument, and it is equally powerful. The proportionality principle must also account for the victims. Justice is not merely about the defendant. It is about the people who were harmed. And when the list of victims is this long, when the harm is this severe, when the pattern is this relentless, the balance shifts. At some point, the rights of the victims to justice, to safety, to the assurance that the person who hurt them will not be released to hurt others must be weighed against the defendant's right to proportionate punishment. And in the case of Eric Cartman, that balance, on any honest assessment, tilts decisively toward incapacitation. The defense might also raise the issue of selective prosecution, arguing that Cartman is being singled out for conduct that in the fictional world of South Park is widespread. The adults of South Park engage in criminal behavior with alarming regularity. Randy Marsh has committed numerous crimes. The police department itself is riddled with incompetence and corruption. The defense would argue that prosecuting Cartman while ignoring the criminal conduct of the adults around him is fundamentally unfair. This argument has some theoretical merit, but in practice, selective prosecution claims are extremely difficult to sustain. The defendant must demonstrate that they were singled out based on an impermissible factor, such as race, religion, or political belief, and that similarly situated individuals were not prosecuted. Cartman would have difficulty making this showing, because no one in South Park or anywhere else is similarly situated to Eric Cartman. His criminal record is unique. The comparison fails because there is no one to compare him to. The prosecutor would respond to each of these arguments with force. On the question of age and brain development, the prosecutor would acknowledge the science but point to the extraordinary sophistication of Cartman's criminal conduct. This is not a child who acts impulsively. This is not a teenager who makes a rash decision in the heat of the moment. This is a child who plans crimes weeks or months in advance, who anticipates the reactions of others, who manipulates institutional structures, who deceives adults and peers with equal skill, and who has never once shown genuine remorse for any of his actions. The prosecutor would argue that Cartman represents the rare exceptional case for which transfer provisions to adult court exist. That his criminal conduct is so extensive, so severe, and so resistant to intervention that the juvenile justice system, with its focus on rehabilitation, is simply inadequate. On the question of environment, the prosecutor would acknowledge Cartman's difficult upbringing, but there is another dimension to all of this that most people overlook when they talk about Cartman and the law. Everything discussed so far has been about the criminal side of things, about the state stepping in and saying this person has broken the rules that society agreed upon. But there is an entirely separate legal universe that exists alongside criminal law, and it is called civil liability. In the civil system, the question is not whether someone should go to prison. The question is whether someone owes money, whether they caused harm that can be measured in dollars, and whether the people they hurt deserve compensation. And when you look at Cartman through this lens, the picture becomes staggering. Because nearly every victim he has ever tormented would have grounds to sue him, not for crimes, for damages. The most obvious civil claim would come from Scott Tenorman. Under Colorado tort law, and really under the tort law of every American state, there is a cause of action called intentional infliction of emotional distress. Sometimes Colorado courts refer to it as outrageous conduct. The elements are straightforward. First, the defendant must have engaged in extreme and outrageous conduct. Second, the defendant must have acted recklessly or with the specific intent to cause severe emotional distress. Third, the plaintiff must have actually suffered severe emotional distress as a result. The legal standard for what counts as extreme and outrageous is high. The conduct must go beyond all possible bounds of decency and must be regarded as atrocious and utterly intolerable in a civilized community. Mere insults, indignities, and petty annoyances do not qualify. But feeding a teenager his own parents in a bowl of chili is not a petty annoyance. That is the kind of conduct that makes the legal standard for outrageousness look almost quaint. Any jury in the country would find that element satisfied in about 30 seconds. Scott Tenorman would also have a wrongful death claim on behalf of his parents. Wrongful death suits require 4 elements. There must be a duty of care, a breach of that duty, causation connecting the breach to the death, and measurable damages suffered by the survivors. While Cartman did not pull the trigger himself, he orchestrated the entire chain of events that led to their deaths. He contacted the farmer. He provided the false information about pony rustlers. He created the circumstances that directly resulted in 2 people being shot. In civil court, the standard of proof is a preponderance of the evidence, which simply means more likely than not. That is a far lower bar than the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. A wrongful death jury would almost certainly find Cartman liable. And the damages in a wrongful death case are not limited to the immediate loss. Under Colorado law, the survivors can recover for loss of companionship, loss of future earnings, funeral expenses, and the emotional suffering caused by the manner of the death. When the manner of death involves being shot by a farmer who was deceived into believing the victims were criminals, and the bodies were then mutilated and served as food to the victim's own child, the emotional suffering component of the damages calculation becomes almost incalculable. No formula exists for putting a dollar figure on that kind of trauma. A jury would simply be asked to determine what number represents fair compensation, and given the facts, that number would be enormous. Kyle Broflovsky would have his own claim for intentional infliction of emotional distress, built on years of anti-Semitic harassment, psychological manipulation, and targeted cruelty. The sheer volume of documented incidents would allow Kyle's attorneys to establish a pattern of conduct so sustained and so vicious that no reasonable person could characterize it as ordinary childhood teasing. Cartman has mocked Kyle's faith in public settings, has attempted to exterminate the Jewish population on multiple occasions, and has weaponized Kyle's religious identity as a tool of humiliation with a consistency that borders on obsession. In tort law, the pattern matters. A single insult might not meet the threshold for outrageous conduct, but hundreds of insults delivered over years, each one calibrated to target the same vulnerability, each one designed to inflict maximum psychological harm, would paint a picture that any jury would find compelling. Butter Stotch might have the strongest cumulative case of all, being locked in a bomb shelter and told the apocalypse had arrived in Casa Bonita, being framed for crimes he did not commit, being subjected to repeated psychological torment that a reasonable person would recognize as systematically destructive. In the Jared Has AIDS episode, Cartman impersonates Butters on prank calls to his own parents, which results in Butters being physically punished for something he never did. The cruelty of that scheme is not just in the prank itself, but in Cartman's understanding that Butters' parents would respond with violence, and his deliberate exploitation of that dynamic. In civil law, this kind of conduct gives rise to what is sometimes called parasitic damages, where the emotional harm is so intertwined with physical consequences that the two cannot be separated. Each of these incidents could support its own independent tort claim, and taken together, they would form one of the most comprehensive civil cases for systematic psychological abuse ever assembled. But the civil liability does not stop with Cartman himself. There is a legal doctrine called negligent supervision, and it opens the door to claims against every institution that should have been protecting these children. South Park Elementary would face enormous exposure. Schools have a well-established legal duty to protect the children in their care by providing appropriate supervision. When a child is injured because a school failed to exercise reasonable care, the school can be held liable. The standard is whether the injury could have been foreseen and prevented through the exercise of reasonable supervision. Cartman has committed acts of violence, psychological torture, and outright criminality on school grounds repeatedly, and the administration has done essentially nothing. Principal Victoria, Mr. Mackey, and the rest of the faculty have witnessed or been informed of his behavior for years. Their failure to intervene, to discipline meaningfully, to report to authorities, or to separate him from his victims would constitute a textbook breach of their duty of care. The families of every child harmed by Cartman at school could name South Park Elementary as a co-defendant in their lawsuits. The South Park Police Department, led by the spectacularly incompetent Officer Barbrady, would face similar claims. Law enforcement has a duty to protect citizens, and when that duty is breached through gross negligence, civil liability follows. Barbrady is an officer who, in the Chicken Lover episode from Season 2, admitted that he could not read. He is the lead law enforcement officer in a town where children are routinely victimized, and his response to reports of criminal activity has ranged from dismissive to absent. The department has consistently failed to investigate crimes, failed to arrest known offenders, and failed to protect children from ongoing harm. There are episodes where Cartman commits acts of violence in plain view of adults, including law enforcement, and faces no consequences whatsoever. In tort law, this is what attorneys call a special relationship giving rise to a duty of care. When the police are informed of a specific identifiable threat to a specific identifiable victim, and they fail to act, the resulting harm creates civil liability. The families of Cartman's victims would not even need to stretch the legal theory. They would simply need to document the number of times law enforcement was aware of his behavior and chose to do nothing. Any competent plaintiff's attorney would add the police department to the list of defendants and argue that their institutional failures created the conditions that allowed Cartman to operate with impunity for years. And then there is Leanne Cartman. Under the legal theory of negligent supervision, a parent can be held civilly liable for the foreseeable harmful acts of their child when the parent knew or should have known about the child's dangerous propensities and failed to take reasonable steps to prevent harm. Leanne does not merely fail to discipline her son, she actively enables his worst behavior. She has seen evidence of his cruelty, his manipulation, and his capacity for violence. She has been told by professionals that he is dangerous, and she has done nothing. The episode makes this painfully clear. When Cesar Millan's techniques actually work and Cartman begins to behave like a reasonable human being, Leanne undoes all of it in a single evening because she is lonely and wants her son to like her. That is not just bad parenting. In a civil courtroom, that is evidence that she understood the danger, saw it being corrected, and deliberately chose to let it return. Every victim of Cartman's subsequent behavior would have grounds to name Leanne as a defendant for negligent supervision, and the episode would be the prosecution's most powerful exhibit. The total damages across all of these civil claims would be astronomical. Compensatory damages for emotional distress, medical expenses for victims who needed therapy, punitive damages designed to punish particularly outrageous conduct. In a case like Scott Tenorman's, punitive damages alone could reach into the millions. Colorado allows punitive damages in cases where the defendant's conduct is attended by circumstances of fraud, malice, or willful and wanton conduct. Cartman's behavior does not just meet this standard, it obliterates it. The ChiliCon Carnival scheme was not reckless. It was meticulously planned, patiently executed, and designed to maximize suffering. A jury instructed on punitive damages would have virtually unlimited discretion to set the amount, constrained only by due process considerations that the United States Supreme Court has addressed in cases limiting punitive awards to single-digit multiples of compensatory damages. But even a conservative multiplier applied to the compensatory damages for feeding someone their own parents would result in a figure that no defendant could ever hope to pay. And unlike criminal court, where the state bears the burden and the defendant has constitutional protections, civil court operates on a lower standard and offers fewer shields. Cartman could invoke the Fifth Amendment to avoid incriminating himself, but his silence could be used against him in a civil proceeding. A civil jury is permitted to draw adverse inferences from a defendant's refusal to testify, which means that Cartman's silence would actually work against him. This is how O.J. Simpson was acquitted in criminal court but found liable in the subsequent wrongful death civil trial. The two systems operate on fundamentally different rules, and the civil system in many ways would be even more devastating to Cartman than the criminal one. Now, consider the Heidi-Turner relationship, which unfolds across seasons 20 and 21. And what becomes visible is not just a bad relationship between two animated children, it is a textbook depiction of domestic abuse, rendered with a precision that makes it useful as a case study in coercive control. And what makes it particularly relevant to this legal raricus is that the show does not play it for laughs. Not really. There are comedic elements because this is South Park, and there are always comedic elements, but the underlying dynamic is portrayed with a seriousness and accuracy that caught many viewers off guard. Trey Parker and Matt Stone were not parodying domestic abuse. They were depicting it, using the language of animation to show something that live-action television often struggles to portray honestly. Under Colorado Revised Statute 1868800, domestic violence is defined not just as physical violence, but as any act or threatened act of violence upon a person with whom the actor is or has been involved in an intimate relationship. The statute goes further. It also encompasses any crime against a person when used as a method of coercion, control, punishment, intimidation, or revenge directed against a person with whom the actor is or has been involved in an intimate relationship. That language is important because it means domestic violence does not require a single punch to be thrown. Psychological manipulation, emotional degradation, isolation from friends and support systems, and threats of self-harm used to maintain control all fall within the statutory definition. Cartman's treatment of Heidi follows the pattern with eerie precision. In the first episode of season 21, White People Renovating Houses, Cartman begins to express annoyance that Heidi is not submissive enough. He blames her for his own unhappiness. He frames her as the source of problems in the relationship rather than acknowledging his own behavior. This is the opening move in what psychologists call the Darvo pattern, an acronym coined by researcher Jennifer Fried in 1997 that stands for deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. The abuser denies the abuse, attacks the person confronting them, and then reverses the roles so that the abuser becomes the supposed victim. Cartman does all three, repeatedly and systematically. In Put It Down, the second episode of season 21, the pattern escalates dramatically. When Heidi attempts to create distance, Cartman leaves her a voicemail threatening to commit suicide if she does not take him back. This is one of the most recognized forms of coercive control. Using threats of self-harm to prevent a partner from leaving is not just emotionally manipulative. Under Colorado law, it constitutes a form of domestic violence because it is a threatened act used as a method of coercion and control within an intimate relationship. Heidi, afraid for Cartman's safety, takes him back. She does not do this because she wants to be with him. She does it because she has been made to feel responsible for his survival. That distinction is critical in domestic violence law because it demonstrates that the victim's continued participation in the relationship is not voluntary, it is compelled. The Doubling Down episode is where the show addresses the psychology of why victims stay in abusive relationships. Cartman presents Heidi with a bucket of KFC chicken, telling her it is vegan. She eats it, feels sick, and begins gaining weight. Behind her back, Cartman tells the other boys that she is getting fat. He is simultaneously causing the problem and mocking her for it. When Heidi's friends express concern and she briefly breaks up with Cartman, those same friends mock her for having dated him in the first place. This is the trap that domestic violence researchers have documented extensively. The victim faces judgment and ridicule from the people who should be her support system, which pushes her back toward the abuser, because at least the abuser pretends to care. Heidi doubles down on the relationship not because she is foolish, but because every exit has been closed off. This is the cruel genius of coercive control. The abuser does not need to lock the doors. He just needs to make every door lead somewhere worse. If Heidi stays with Cartman, she suffers his manipulation. If she leaves, she faces the ridicule of her peers and the guilt of believing she is responsible for his potential suicide. If she seeks help from the school, there is no mechanism for protection. If she tells her parents, the show suggests they are as oblivious as every other adult in South Park. The system has failed her at every level, and Cartman has exploited every one of those failures. What makes this arc legally significant is that it tracks real-world domestic violence dynamics so closely that it could be used in a courtroom to explain coercive control to a jury. The isolation from friends, the gaslighting about food and health, the suicide threats used as leverage, the Darvo reversals where Cartman claims he is the one being abused, the gradual erosion of the victim's identity until she begins adopting the abuser's worldview. Consider the trajectory carefully. In Season 20, Heidi is presented as one of the most emotionally intelligent children in the school. She is kind, she is thoughtful, she reaches out to Cartman when he is at his most isolated because she genuinely believes in empathy as a guiding principle. And over the course of 2 seasons, that person is systematically dismantled. The show does not rush the transformation. It happens in stages, each one building on the last, each one closing off another avenue of escape. First, Cartman isolates her from her friends by making the relationship a source of embarrassment for anyone associated with it. Then he undermines her physical health by lying about what she is eating. Then he attacks her self-image by mocking her weight to others while pretending to support her to her face. Then he weaponizes her empathy by threatening self-harm whenever she tries to leave. By the end of Season 21, Heidi has transformed from a bright, independent, empathetic person into someone who parrots Cartman's bigotry and cruelty. She begins making the same kinds of hateful comments that Cartman makes. She turns on her former friends. She adopts his worldview not because she believes in it, but because her identity has been so thoroughly eroded that she no longer has a worldview of her own. That transformation is not a character flaw. It is a documented consequence of sustained coercive control, and domestic violence researchers have a term for it. They call it the abuser's colonization of the victim's identity. If this case were prosecuted under Colorado domestic violence statutes, the prosecution would not need to prove a single act of physical violence. The pattern of coercion, control, intimidation, and psychological manipulation would satisfy the statutory elements. The suicide threats alone would constitute criminal menacing or reckless endangerment when used to control an intimate partner. A prosecutor would present the voicemail from Put It Down as Exhibit A because it is a recorded confession. It is Cartman in his own voice telling another person that he will end his life unless she complies with his demands. That is not ambiguous. That is not subject to interpretation. That is a threat, captured on audio, used to coerce compliance from an intimate partner. And because Colorado treats domestic violence as a sentence enhancer rather than a standalone charge, every underlying offense committed against Heidi as a method of coercion or control would carry the domestic violence designation, increasing penalties and triggering mandatory treatment requirements. This means that the harassment charges become harassment with a domestic violence enhancer. The menacing charges become menacing with a domestic violence enhancer. Each enhanced charge carries stiffer penalties and creates a cumulative record that influences sentencing on every subsequent charge. The domestic violence designation also triggers mandatory arrest provisions, meaning that once law enforcement is made aware of the situation, they have no discretion, they are required to make an arrest. The fact that no arrest was ever made in South Park speaks again to the institutional failures that run through this entire raricist like a fault line. And if you are enjoying this, a quick subscribe really does help. It is free, and it means we can keep making these long videos for you. Leanne Cartman is one of the most fascinating characters in the entire show, not because of what she does, but because of what she does not do. She is a single mother raising a child who is, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most dangerous minors in fictional history. And her response to this reality has been, almost without exception, to do absolutely nothing. From a legal perspective, this is not just negligent parenting. Under Colorado law, it could constitute criminal conduct. And what makes her case so legally compelling is that, unlike most negligent parents who simply do not see the danger, Leanne has been shown the danger in vivid, unmistakable terms. She has been confronted with evidence of her son's pathology by trained professionals. She has watched those professionals fail, break down, and in one case, lose their sanity trying to manage him. She cannot claim ignorance. The evidence will not let her. Colorado Revised Statute 186401 defines child abuse and addresses criminal liability for parents and guardians. The statute establishes a sliding scale of culpability. When a person acts knowingly or recklessly and child abuse results in death, it is a Class 2 felony. When criminal negligence results in death, it is a Class 3 felony. When knowing or reckless conduct results in serious bodily injury, it is a Class 3 felony. But the statute does not only apply when the parent directly harms the child. It also applies when a parent's negligence allows harm to occur, either to the child in question or through the child's unsupervised behavior to others. Under the Colorado Children's Code, specifically CRS 103. Abuse and neglect are defined broadly. Neglect includes situations where a parent or guardian fails to take the same actions to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, medical care, or supervision that a prudent parent would take. The key word is supervision. A prudent parent whose child had committed even a fraction of the acts Cartman has committed would take dramatic steps. They would seek psychiatric evaluation, they would cooperate with law enforcement, they would impose restrictions on the child's freedom, they would report the child's behavior to the relevant authorities. Leanne has done none of these things. What makes Leanne's case particularly compelling from a legal standpoint is the Tst episode, which aired as the 7th episode of Season 10 on May 3rd, 2006. In that episode, Leanne has reached such a point of desperation that she brings in multiple reality television experts to help control her son. The first experts fail spectacularly. One is driven to a mental breakdown. But when Cesar Millan arrives and applies behavioral conditioning techniques, Cartman's behavior actually improves. He becomes calmer, more cooperative, less destructive. For a brief window, the episode shows what Cartman could be with consistent, firm parenting. And then Leon destroys it. When Millan declines a personal outing because he views their relationship as professional, Leon turns to Cartman for companionship. She offers him whatever he wants, and just like that, all the progress evaporates. The episode ends with Cartman smiling in a way that signals his worst impulses have been fully restored. In a criminal proceeding, this episode would be devastating evidence against Leanne. It demonstrates 3 critical things. First, she was aware that her son's behavior was dangerous enough to require professional intervention. She knew. She sought help because she knew. Second, she saw that proper behavioral management could actually work. She witnessed the improvement with her own eyes. Third, she deliberately chose to undo that improvement because her emotional needs as a lonely adult took priority over the safety of her child and every other person her child would subsequently harm. This is not an oversight. This is not ignorance. This is a parent who had knowledge, saw a solution, and consciously rejected it. Colorado law also imposes reporting obligations. Under CRS 1930304, certain individuals are designated as mandatory reporters who must report suspected child abuse or neglect. While parents are not typically classified as mandatory reporters in the traditional sense, a parent who becomes aware that their child is engaging in criminal behavior has an obligation not to facilitate or enable that behavior. Leanne does not merely fail to report. She actively provides Cartman with resources, freedom, and emotional validation that enable his worst conduct. She has financed his schemes. She has allowed him unsupervised access to the internet, to weapons, to other children. She has declined to cooperate with school officials who raised concerns about his behavior. When Mr. Mackey or Principal Victoria have attempted to address Cartman's conduct, Leanne's response has typically been either passive agreement followed by no action, or outright dismissal of the concern. In a courtroom, this pattern of non-response would be presented as evidence of a deliberate choice. The prosecution would argue that Leanne was not unaware of her obligations. She was aware of them and chose, repeatedly and consistently, to ignore them. A prosecution of Leanne Cartman would likely focus on the legal theory of criminal negligence, defined in Colorado as the failure to perceive a substantial and unjustifiable risk that constitutes a gross deviation from the standard of care that a reasonable person would exercise. But the St episode undermines even a negligence theory, because negligence requires a failure to perceive the risk. Leanne perceived it, she recognized it, she hired professionals to address it, and then she chose to let it come back. That elevates her culpability from negligence to recklessness, which is defined as consciously disregarding a substantial and unjustifiable risk. The difference matters enormously in sentencing. A reckless mental state turns a Class 3 felony into a Class 2 felony in child abuse cases. It is the difference between years in prison and decades. And in Leanne's case, the recklessness is not a single moment of poor judgment. It is a sustained pattern of behavior that extends across the entire run of the show. She has had opportunity after opportunity to intervene, to seek help, to impose consequences, to do the bare minimum that the law requires of a parent. And at every juncture, she has chosen the path of least resistance, the path that keeps Cartman happy and keeps her from being alone, regardless of the cost to everyone else. Every parent whose child was subsequently harmed by Cartman after the events of Cyst would have a legitimate argument that Leanne's conscious decision to abandon effective behavioral management was a proximate cause of their child's injuries. The legal concept of proximate cause asks whether the harm was a foreseeable consequence of the defendant's conduct. After Tst, foreseeability is not even a question. Leanne watched her son terrorize professional behavioral experts. She watched one of them suffer a complete psychological breakdown. She saw with her own eyes what he was capable of, and she saw that it could be managed, and she chose not to manage it. Every act of cruelty Cartman committed after that episode is a foreseeable consequence of her decision. Every victim he harmed after that evening is someone whose suffering traces back, at least in part, to a mother who chose companionship over responsibility. There is also the question of what Leanne knew about specific criminal acts that Cartman committed in and around the home. A parent who discovers evidence of criminal behavior in their child's bedroom, on their child's computer, or in their child's possession and fails to act on that knowledge can face charges for aiding and abetting, accessory after the fact, or obstruction of justice. Leanne's house has been the staging ground for multiple criminal enterprises. She has cooked meals while her son plotted atrocities in the next room. She has driven him to locations where he intended to commit crimes. The line between negligent supervision and active facilitation is one that a prosecutor would draw very carefully. And in Leon's case, there are moments where she crosses it entirely. She saw the fix, she held it in her hands, and she let it go because she wanted her son to be her friend instead of her responsibility. There is yet another category of Cartman's criminal behavior that deserves careful examination, and it is one that tends to get lost in discussions about his more violent offenses. Eric Cartman is a serial identity fraud offender. He impersonates real people, fabricates entire identities, and exploits institutional trust for personal gain. And under Colorado law, each of these acts constitutes a separate criminal offense with its own set of penalties. Consider for a moment how unusual this is. Most fictional characters who commit crimes do so in ways that fit neatly into one or two legal categories. A murderer murders. A thief steals, a con artist deceives, but Cartman moves fluidly between identity fraud, impersonation, and institutional manipulation in a way that suggests he intuitively understands the vulnerabilities of the systems he exploits. He does not need to study law to break it effectively. He simply looks at a structure, identifies its pressure points, and applies exactly the right kind of deception to make it collapse in his favor. The clearest example occurs in Let Go, Let Gov, the first episode of Season 17, which aired on September 25, 2013. In this episode, Cartman walks into the headquarters of the National Security Agency and introduces himself as Bill Clinton, not as someone who resembles Bill Clinton, not as a fan of Bill Clinton, as Bill Clinton himself, a former president of the United States, presenting himself to a federal agency as a job applicant. The NSA chief hires him. Cartman then gains access to classified surveillance systems, views private communications, and eventually attempts to leak intelligence information to the public. Under Colorado Revised Statute 18113, criminal impersonation occurs when a person knowingly assumes a false or fictitious identity and in that identity performs an act with intent to unlawfully gain a benefit or to injure or defraud another. Depending on the specific subsection violated, criminal impersonation ranges from a Class 2 misdemeanor to a Class 5 felony. Impersonating a former president to gain access to a federal intelligence agency would almost certainly fall at the felony end of that spectrum. The absurdity of the NSA actually hiring him does not diminish the criminal liability. It amplifies it, because the statute does not require the impersonation to be convincing. It requires the impersonation to be knowing and to be performed with the intent to gain a benefit. Cartman knew he was not Bill Clinton. He assumed that identity specifically to gain access to systems and information he was not entitled to. That the institution was foolish enough to believe him as a reflection of institutional failure, not a defense for the perpetrator. And that is before considering federal charges for unauthorized access to classified information, which would add entire additional layers of criminal liability that operate independently of Colorado state law. The Fat Butt and Pancake Head episode, which aired as the 5th episode of Season 7 on April 16, 2003, presents a different but equally fascinating case. Cartman draws a face on his hand, gives it a wig, and introduces it as Jennifer Lopez. What begins as a crude ventriloquist act at school somehow escalates into the hand puppet signing a record deal and entering a romantic relationship with Ben Affleck. The legal question here is more nuanced than it first appears. Cartman is not impersonating the real Jennifer Lopez in the traditional sense. He is creating a competing identity that shares her name and cultural identity, which causes real commercial harm to the actual Jennifer Lopez by displacing her record contract. Under CRS 18590, Colorado's identity theft statute, a person commits identity theft when they knowingly use someone else's personal identifying information without permission with the intent to obtain cash, credit, property, services, or any other thing of value. A record deal is a thing of value. The use of Jennifer Lopez's name and persona to obtain that deal satisfies the statutory elements. The fact that the impersonation was performed by a hand puppet does not create a legal defense. The intent to gain a benefit through the unauthorized use of another person's identity is what matters, not the sophistication of the method. The Sissy, the third episode of Season 18, which premiered on October 8, 2014, presents what might be the most legally complex impersonation case. Cartman puts a bow on his hat and declares himself to be transgender, using the name and identity to gain access to the girls' bathroom. His stated motivation is not gender identity. It is avoiding the wait for the boys' bathroom stalls. When the school capitulates and installs a private bathroom for him, he has successfully used a fabricated identity to obtain a tangible benefit. The legal reruses here must be handled with considerable care. Legitimate transgender identity is, of course, protected under both Colorado and federal law. But Cartman is not claiming a legitimate transgender identity. He is explicitly and knowingly fabricating one to gain a personal advantage. Under CRS 185-113, assuming a false identity with the intent to gain a benefit constitutes criminal impersonation. The fact that the false identity involves a protected characteristic does not immunize the fraud. If anything, it aggravates it because it undermines genuine protections for people who actually need them. When Wendy Testaberger responds by also claiming to be transgender under the name Wendell, specifically to challenge Cartman's fraud, the episode illustrates how one person's cynical exploitation of identity protections can create a cascade of institutional confusion that harms everyone involved. The school administration, caught between its desire to be inclusive and its suspicion that it is being manipulated, ends up implementing a series of increasingly absurd bathroom policies that serve no one. This is exactly the kind of institutional harm that identity fraud statutes are designed to prevent. The law does not just protect the individual whose identity is stolen, it protects the integrity of the systems that rely on identity to function. What connects all three of these episodes is a consistent pattern. Cartman identifies an institution with exploitable trust mechanisms, whether that is the NSA, the entertainment industry, or a public school's anti-discrimination policies. He fabricates an identity designed to exploit those specific mechanisms, and he uses the fabricated identity to obtain benefits he would not otherwise receive. This is not childish mischief, this is systematic fraud. Each incident demonstrates the same criminal mindset, the same willingness to deceive, and the same understanding that institutions can be manipulated through identity-based deception. A prosecutor building a case against Cartman would use this pattern to establish what the law calls a common scheme or plan, evidence that the defendant's criminal acts are not isolated mistakes, but reflections of an ongoing criminal methodology. There is also the question of the Mitch Connor persona, which Cartman deploys through his hand puppet in Fat Button Pancakehead and returns to in later episodes. But that thread alone could fill its own reruses, and what matters here is the pattern. The pattern of fab. And if you are still here, whether you are listening closely or drifting somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, subscribing to the channel is the most meaningful way to support what we do. It costs nothing. It takes a second, and it is the reason these long, careful, unhurried videos continue to exist. That is all. When you step back from the individual charges and look at the complete picture, what Eric Cartman's criminal career reveals is not just the story of one fictional child, it is a mirror held up to the American justice system itself. And what it reflects is not flattering. The system that governs criminal law in the United States was built on a set of assumptions. It assumes that consequences follow actions. It assumes that punishment deters future offenses. It assumes that the institutions responsible for identifying, prosecuting, and correcting criminal behavior will function with at least a minimal degree of competence. And it assumes, perhaps most importantly, that society will not simply look the other way when someone causes harm. Cartman's entire existence is a refutation of every single one of those assumptions. Consider the structural failures first. Cartman has committed crimes that were witnessed by dozens of people. He has committed crimes on camera, he has committed crimes in front of law enforcement officers. He has confessed to crimes openly, sometimes boastfully, and yet, in 25+ seasons of the show, the legal system has almost never held him accountable in any meaningful or lasting way. He has been arrested, he has been detained, he has, on occasion, faced consequences that lasted for the duration of a single episode, but he has never been prosecuted in a way that produced lasting change in his behavior. He has never served a meaningful sentence. He has never been placed in a program that addressed the root causes of his conduct. The system touches him and then releases him, over and over again, like a revolving door that spins so fast it generates its own wind. This is not an accident of writing. It is a deliberate satirical choice by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, and the target of the satire is the system itself. The American justice system, as it actually exists, is full of Cartmans. Not children who cook people into chili, obviously, but people who cause enormous harm and face minimal consequences because the system is not designed to handle them. White-collar criminals who defraud thousands and receive probation. Wealthy defendants who hire attorneys capable of exploiting every procedural loophole in the code. Juveniles whose cases are dismissed because the court lacks resources, or because the offense does not meet the threshold for prosecution, or because the political will to hold a child accountable simply does not exist. The system is not broken in the way that a machine is broken, where a single part fails and the whole thing stops working. It is broken in the way that a net is broken, where the holes are just wide enough for certain people to slip through, and the people who slip through are disproportionately the ones who cause the most damage. Cartman slips through every hole. He slips through because he is a child, and the system is reluctant to prosecute children. He slips through because his crimes are so bizarre that no prosecutor would know how to present them to a jury. He slips through because the witnesses to his crimes are other children, whose testimony is easily challenged. He slips through because his mother, Leanne Cartman, is so permissive and so emotionally dependent on her son's approval that she would never cooperate with a prosecution. He slips through because the town of South Park itself has developed a collective tolerance for chaos that renders its institutions incapable of responding to anything with sustained attention. The police are incompetent. The school administrators are overwhelmed. The parents are disengaged. The federal government is distracted. Every layer of the system that should catch someone like Cartman has a reason not to, and those reasons, taken together, create a perfect environment for impunity. This is what makes South Park's satire so effective and so uncomfortable. The show does not ask the audience to sympathize with Cartman. It asks the audience to recognize that the systems that should stop him are the same systems that operate in the real world, and that those systems fail for the same reasons in both contexts: lack of resources, lack of will, institutional inertia, cultural tolerance for certain kinds of harm, the belief that someone else will handle it, the assumption that the problem will resolve itself. These are not fictional failures. They are real ones, and the fact that they are illustrated through the medium of a foul-mouthed animated child does not make them any less real. There is also a deeper philosophical question embedded in Cartman's story, and it is a question that the justice system has never adequately answered. What do you do with someone who cannot be rehabilitated? The American criminal justice system, particularly the juvenile justice system, is built on the premise that people can change. That intervention, education, therapy, and structured consequences can redirect a person's behavior towards something more constructive. This premise is, in most cases, correct. Most juvenile offenders do not become adult criminals. Most people who commit crimes in their youth grow out of the behaviors that led to those crimes. The system works imperfectly and unevenly, but it works for most people. But it does not work for everyone. And Cartman is the embodiment of the cases where it does not work. He has received interventions, he has received consequences, he has been confronted with the harm he has caused. And none of it has changed him, not because the interventions were inadequate, though they often were, but because Cartman does not want to change. He does not see his behavior as problematic, he does not experience remorse, he does not value the well-being of others, and he does not fear consequences because his experience has taught him correctly that consequences are temporary and avoidable. The system has no answer for this. It has no protocol for the person who absorbs every lesson and learns nothing. It has no framework for the offender who treats rehabilitation as just another system to be gamed, and it has no mechanism for protecting society from someone who will, with absolute certainty, continue to cause harm for as long as he is free to do so. This is the question that Cartman's criminal career poses to the audience, and it is a question that the show wisely never answers, because the real justice system has not answered it either. So what would a lawyer say about Eric Cartman? A lawyer would say that the case file is unlike anything the American legal system has ever seen. A lawyer would say that the charges span every category of criminal law, from petty misdemeanors to capital felonies, from state offenses to federal crimes, from property destruction to crimes against humanity. A lawyer would say that the defendant is, by any clinical measure, among the most dangerous individuals ever to be evaluated by a court, and that his age makes him not less dangerous but more so, because the system has fewer tools available to address the threat he poses. A lawyer would say that the victims of his crimes number in the dozens, possibly the hundreds, and that the harm he has caused is measured not just in dollars or injuries, but in shattered lives, broken families, and a community that has been fundamentally altered by his presence in it. A lawyer would say all of these things. And then a lawyer would say something else. A lawyer would say that despite everything, despite the murders and the fraud and the arson and the hate crimes and the biological warfare and the identity theft and the obstruction of justice and the perjury and the environmental destruction and the psychological torture, despite all of it, Eric Cartman would probably walk, not because he is innocent, Not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the system was never built to handle someone like him. And that, more than any individual crime, is the most damning indictment of all. That is what a lawyer would say about Eric Cartman. And that is, perhaps, the thought worth carrying with you as you drift off tonight. Not the horror of what one fictional child has done, but the quiet, uncomfortable recognition that the systems we trust to protect us from people like him are not nearly as strong as we believe them to be. They are held together by assumptions, by conventions, by the collective agreement that most people will follow the rules most of the time. And when someone comes along who does not follow the rules, who has never followed the rules, who treats the rules as nothing more than a list of suggestions written by people too weak to do what he does, the system does not rise to meet the challenge. It bends, it strains, and more often than we would like to admit, it breaks. Sleep well. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.